Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining History for Shut-ins, episode number 14. Today, we move forward in American history by talking about the presidencies of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Adams clearly thought he was heir apparent to Washington. Otherwise, he would not have signed up to be the vice president for a second term. John Adams, and it's really because of the way Washington treated the position of the vice president, but John Adams said it is the most useless position in the government. When Washington, in his farewell address, which was published in September of 1796, announced that he was going to retire, the nation faced its first contested presidential election. You have Federalists in Congress that caucused and nominate John Adams and Thomas Pinckney out of South Carolina. Pinckney had been a soldier in the Revolutionary War and served under Washington as a diplomat. The Democratic Republicans nominate Thomas Jefferson, and Aaron Burr out of New York. Burr had served in the Continental Army and as a senator early in Washington's presidency. Each party named two presidential candidates because under the original Constitution, each member electoral college was to cast two ballots for the presidency. When the contest began in 1796, remember yesterday when talking about Washington, and Washington really did not have to campaign for the presidency. It was basically handed to him, rightfully so. He was recruited, he ran, he is elected. But during these times, campaigning is considered self-promotion, of course, which it is, but it's frowned upon. Imagine if that was the case today. That would be great. But Burr is the only one at the time in 1796 to wage an active campaign. Supporters of the four candidates campaigned vigorously, but Burr is the only one who personally campaigns for himself. The Federalists label Jefferson a Francophile. Think of what's happening. The French Revolution has been going on and is nothing like the American Revolution. Napoleon is in power. He's a dictator, basically. The Federalists also questioned Jefferson's courage during the war. He never served. Well, he did happen to write the Declaration of Independence. They also said that he was an atheist, which is amazing. Think back now, recently in elections, religion really has not been an issue for a candidate. The most contemporary example of that is most likely John F. Kennedy. When he ran for the presidency as a Catholic, there was concern that he would take direction from the Pope. Here, it's the other end of the rainbow where the Federalists are saying that Jefferson has no faith. He is an atheist. He does not believe in God, so they use that against him. Adams is portrayed as a monarchist and an Anglophile. So when the French Revolution started, who was fighting? The British and the French. So Jefferson is a Francophile, Adams is an Anglophile. And again, people called Adams a monarchist because his son, John Quincy Adams, is waiting in the wings. And the fear is that there will be this great political dynasty, which of course there is, in about another 20 years. They also say that Adams is power hungry. And again, as president, I don't know that you have to be power hungry, but you have to absolutely come to the realization that great powers will be put at your hands. Adams has trouble in his own Federalist camp. Rumors swirled that his chief rival for leadership among the Federalists, normally the president is the head of the party, but in this case, it's Alexander Hamilton, who's the head of the Federalists. He secretly favors Pinckney. And he favors Pinckney because Pinckney isn't as obstinate or as hard-headed as Adams. Many believed that Hamilton sought to have some of the Federalist electors withhold their votes from Adams so that Pinckney could outpoll him. Remember, at this time, the top two vote getters, regardless of party, are president and vice president, respectively. Adams wins by a 3-vote margin. Although virtually all of his votes came from Northern electors, while Jefferson's come from Southern electors, Adams won because of the votes of 2 Southern electors. A Virginia elector from a county with a strong tradition of opposition to planter aristocrats, which is what Jefferson was seen as, voted for Adams, as did an elector from a commercial district in coastal North Carolina. Jefferson received the second largest number of votes. The nation would have a president from one party and the vice president from another party. As I said yesterday, imagine if that happened today. It'd be crazy. At the time, 7 states permitted popular voting in this election. In the remaining 9 states, state legislatures elected the members of the Electoral College. Popular opinion at the time is difficult to gauge, although Adams has appeared to receive support in recognition for his long service during the Revolution. Adams' style was largely to leave domestic matters to Congress and control foreign policy himself. No other person in the United States had as much diplomatic experience as Adams. Remember, he was first a diplomat to France with Franklin, during the war, and then he is the first diplomat to the court of St. James, to Great Britain, after the war. So he brings a lot to the table in that respect. As a result of his outlook, much of Adams' domestic policy was intertwined with his foreign policy, as diplomatic issues often sparked a domestic reaction that consumed not only Adams, but of course the electorate. On the heels of the XYZ affair, which we will talk about in a little bit, there were negative sentiments against the French. Sensing this mood and identifying an opportunity to crush the pro-French Democratic Republicans, the Federalist-dominated Congress drafted and passed the Alien and Sedition Acts during the spring and summer of 1798. Adams signed the legislation into law. This is one of the black marks on Adams' legacy. The acts were made up of 4 pieces of legislation that became bitterly contested as a domestic issue during Adams' presidency. Supposedly created as a means of preventing the aiding and abetting of France within the United States and of obstructing U.S. foreign policy, the laws had domestic political overtones. 3 of the laws were aimed at immigrants, most of whom tended to vote for Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans. Almost sounds like current day politics, correct? The Naturalization Act increased the residency period required for citizenship from 5 to 14 years. The Alien Act, which is the only one of the 4 acts to pass with bipartisan support in Congress, allowed for the detention of enemy aliens in time of war without trial or counsel. Very similar to Lincoln suspending the right or the writ of habeas corpus during the Civil War. The Alien Enemies Act empowered the president to deport aliens whom he deemed dangerous to the security of the nation. The Sedition Act outlawed conspiracy to prevent the enforcement of federal laws and punished subversive speech with fines and imprisonment. So this is absolutely going against the First Amendment, freedom of speech. There were 15 indictments and 10 convictions under the Sedition Act during the final 1.5 years of Adams' administration. Adams is a one-term president. No aliens were deported or arrested, although hundreds left the U.S. in 1798 and 1799. To pay for military measures enacted during the XYZ crisis, a Federalist Congress enacts heavy new stamp and house taxes. Again, goes against the filming of the Revolution with the Stamp Act and whatnot, the Intolerable Acts. Farmers in eastern Pennsylvania rioted and attacked federal tax collectors in an incident later referred to as Fry's Rebellion, F-R-I-E-S. They believed that the new taxes were designed to support a large standing army and navy. So not only is Congress concerned about a large standing army, so is the electorate, so are the citizens. Several leaders of Fry's Rebellion are arrested and sentenced to death for treason. On the eve of the election of 1800, Adams pardons them all. In response to the Federalists' use of federal power, which was seen as an overreach, Democratic Republicans Thomas Jefferson and James Madison secretly draft a set of resolutions. These resolutions, were introduced into the Kentucky and Virginia legislatures in the fall of 1798. Jefferson and Madison argued that since the Constitution was created by compact among the states, the people, speaking through their state legislatures, had the authority to judge the legitimacy of federal actions. So here we go again with states' rights versus federal power or the federal government. They deemed the Alien and Sedition Acts null and void. As I mentioned yesterday, we will talk about a similar occurrence known as the nullification crisis during Andrew Jackson's presidency. Although no other states formally supported the resolutions, what they do is they rally Democratic Republicans in the United States. They place the Democratic Republicans within the revolutionary tradition of resistance to tyranny, government overreach. The resolutions also raise the issues of states' rights and the constitutional question of how conflict between federal and state authorities would be resolved short of secession, which will be discussed over the next decades until the Civil War, of course, or war itself. Adams' presidency was consumed with problems that came out of the French Revolution. Initially popular in the United States, the French Revolution began to raise concerns among the most conservative in the United States after excesses that began in 1792. The King and Queen of France are killed. Attempts at de-Christianization occur. Foes of the revolution, basically aristocrats and monarchists, were killed in the September Massacre of 1792, and the Reign of Terror 1793, 1794. This is all taking place during Washington's presidency. Revolutionary leadership moved towards social leveling in France that would end historic class privileges and distinctions between each of the social classes. Adams saw the coming of the French Revolution while living in France and Great Britain. Jay's Treaty plunged John Adams into a foreign crisis that lasted for the duration of his administration. Adams tries diplomacy by sending 3 commissioners to Paris to negotiate a settlement. The Prime Minister, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand of France, insults U.S. diplomats by first refusing to officially receive them. He then demands a $250,000 personal bribe and a $10 million loan for France before he would begin peace negotiations. This is what's known as the XYZ affair. Adams responds by asking Congress to appropriate money for defensive measures. These included building up the Navy, improved coastal defenses, creation of a provisional army, not a standing army, and authority for the president to summon up to 80,000 militiamen to active duty. Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts to decrease dissent. They created the Navy Department. They organized the Marine Corps, and they canceled treaties of alliance and commerce with France that had been negotiated during the Revolutionary War. Incidents start taking place on the high seas. This time period with these instances become known as the Quasi-War Crisis. Some in the United States who hated the French Revolution, especially those who supported the British, hoped for war to save the United States, to save the British and to destroy France. From the outset, Adams sought a peaceful resolution, if it could be had on honorable terms for the United States. He urged a military buildup, but his goal was to demonstrate the resolve of the United States and bring France to the bargaining table. During the fall of 1798 and the winter of 1799, he received intelligence indicating that France was open to speak with him. When Talleyrand sent unofficial word that U.S. diplomats would be received by the French government, Adams announced his intention to send another diplomatic commission to France. By the time commissioners reached Paris late in 1799, Napoleon was the head of the French government. So Napoleon does not follow Washington's lead. After having power thrown at him, Napoleon eats it up. Washington, of course, defers. After several weeks of negotiation, U.S. envoys and Napoleon signed the Treaty of Mortefontaine, that's Mortefontaine, which released the United States from its Revolutionary War alliance with France and brought an end to the Quasi-War. Adams said that honorable peace that he'd arranged was the great jewel in his crown after years and years of public service. Adams' aloofness and refusal to enter directly into political conflict probably undermined his effectiveness and cost him re-election in 1800. He was stubbornly independent, but it left him politically isolated. His own cabinet opposed his policies much of the time. He valued no one's opinion other than perhaps his wife's, Abigail Adams. As an active party politician who distrusted factionalism and many of his fellow Federalist leaders, Adams was out of place in a partisan United States that he actually had helped bring to life. Much of Adams' isolation reflected a well-conceived value system in which he believed that the president should stand above politics, if that were only true. He viewed the legislature as subject to corruption and refused to work with it on a close basis. So he's not working with Congress. He's not working with the Senate. He prided himself on never giving in to public opinion that conflicted with his principles. He counted himself among those natural aristocrats who were born for leadership because of superior reason and virtue. He distrusted the people and feared majority rule. Quite frankly, many of the founding fathers distrusted the people. They thought if that a true democracy had been founded, much like Rome, which starts as an oligarchy, goes to democracy, and then turns into anarchy, they thought that the same thing would happen in the United States. Adams believed that the danger to U.S. society in 1800 did not come from excessive authority, but from conflict and anarchy. His elite republicanism stood in contrast to the egalitarian Jeffersonian ideal of democracy that was poised to assume power in the new century, of course, with Jefferson's election and then Madison's and Monroe's. Adams is correct in not expanding the naval war with France into an all-out conflict. Another protracted war so soon after the Revolution might have been fatal for the new republic, and especially because of the factionalism in the United States. Adams nearly won the 1800 election, and he might be seen differently had he completed a second term. He has been criticized greatly for signing the Alien and Sedition Acts, although he neither openly advocated their passage nor personally implemented them. When faced with populist defiance, such as Fry's Rebellion, he ignores Hamilton's call for a strong show of federal force, much like the Whiskey Rebellion during Washington's time. Adams pardons the leaders of Fry's Rebellion. We are now going to talk about Thomas Jefferson, a fascinating man. Adams faces a difficult re-election in 1800. The Federalists are deeply split over his foreign policy. Many oppose his decision to send envoys to Paris in 1799 because they feared it would result in national humiliation for the United States, and they wanted to maintain the quasi-war for partisan ends. Early in 1800, Adams fires two members of his cabinet, Timothy Pickering, who's the Secretary of State, and James McHenry, who is the Secretary of War, for their failure to support his foreign policy. This alienates Federalists whose votes he's going to need to be reelected. The Democratic Republicans are furious because of the creation of a standing army, because of new taxes, and because of the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Federalists nominate Adams and Charles Cotesworth Pinckney out of South Carolina, who was an officer in the in the Continental Army. He was a member of the Constitutional Convention and part of the diplomatic commission that Adams had sent to France in 1797. So he's got a pretty good resume. The Federalists did not designate a choice for president, but asked their electors to cast their two votes for Adams and Pinckney. The Democratic Republicans renominate Jefferson and Burr, their candidates from the 1796 election, with Jefferson as their choice for president. The Federalists depict Jefferson once again as an atheist, as a radical revolutionary, which is ironic because, of course, that is how our nation was founded. He was often called a Jacobin, which was the name of the most radical faction in France during the French Revolution. His election, the Federalists said, would bring about a reign of terror in the United States. Democratic Republicans cast Adams once again as a monarchist and Federalists as an enemy of republicanism, including the greater egalitarianism promised by the American Revolution. Adams was accused of plotting to have his son marry one of the daughters of King George III to establish a dynasty that would unite both the United States and Great Britain. The plot, allegedly, according to Democratic Republicans, had been stopped only by the intervention of George Washington, who had dressed in his Revolutionary War uniform to confront Adams with his sword in his hand. Washington, that is. You can't make this stuff up. Well, apparently you can. Jefferson was accused of also conducting bizarre ritualistic rites at Monticello. So you can see partisanship is at an all-time high. And of course, it seems to just ratchet up with each election. One of Adams' greatest foes, who we've talked about, is Alexander Hamilton, a fellow Federalist. In October of 1800, Hamilton publishes a pamphlet in which he argues that Adams should not be reelected. He charges that Adams is emotionally unstable, given to impulsive and irrational decisions, unable to coexist with his closest advisors, and unfit for duty. Hamilton actually lobbies to elect Pinckney. He persuades all Federalist presidential electors, from the North to vote for the Federalist nominees, Adams and Pinckney, while trying to convince some Southern electors to withhold their vote for Adams. That would then enable Pinckney to outpoll Adams. So a lot of behind the scenes here. Hamilton fails. Not only did numerous New England Federalists who were pro-John Adams withhold their second vote from Pinckney, but Federalists were actually outpolled by Democratic Republicans. Pinckney actually finishes fourth in balloting. Adams stood third in electoral votes, while Jefferson and Burr tied for first place. Once again, the United States voted on sectional lines. 86% of Adams' votes were cast by Northern electors. Nearly 75% of Jefferson's votes were Southern. Party discipline was greatly improved over the election of 1796. In 1796, nearly 40% of electors refused to follow the recommendations of their party's caucus. In 1800, only one elector broke ranks, a New England elector who withheld his second vote for Pinckney. Only 5 states, down from 7 in 1796, permitted qualified voters to elect the members of the Electoral College. State legislators made the choice in the remaining 11 states. Several states abandoned the election of electors in districts and instituted a winner-take-all system. Virginia adopts the at-large format, which enabled Jefferson to win all 21 votes from his home state. Had the election been held by district, Adams likely would have won up to 9 votes. Adams is the first presidential candidate affected by the 3/5 compromise. The 3/5 compromise was a decision which permitted the counting of 60% of the slave population for purposes of representation in the House of Representatives and the Electoral College. The Three-Fifths Compromise increases the political clout of the South because that's where the vast majority of slaves are. Had no slaves been counted, Adams would have beaten Jefferson. The election also turns on the outcome in New York State. The Democratic Republican Party won control of the New York State legislature in May of 1800, winning every contested seat in New York City. Control of the assembly meant that Jefferson would receive all 12 New York electoral votes, where Adams had won in 1796. Jefferson's victory in 1800 also stems from the disunion of Federalists and the superior party organization of Democratic Republicans, which enabled them to capture not only the presidency, but Congress. Democratic Republicans started several new newspapers and created committees of correspondence to direct the distribution of campaign literature and plan meetings and rallies. Democratic Republican victories, due to 4 years of this party organization, sophisticated political campaigning, and the shaping of the party machine, were responses to the mood of the electorate. The electorate was sick of the Federalists. With the election a tie, it was sent to the House of Representatives as is stipulated in the Constitution. Every Democratic Republican delegation in the House stood by Jefferson. Some Northern Federalists favored Burr. After 35 ballots and 5 days of voting, the House was deadlocked. Each vote ended with Jefferson receiving 8 votes to Burr's 6 votes. The delegations from Vermont and Maryland were deadlocked and could not cast a ballot. Burr refused to step down out of the potential president position, although during the election he said he had no desire to be president. He only wanted to be vice president. So once there's a tie, he says, hey, I've got a shot here. I'm going to run for the presidency. Throughout the long battle, Hamilton worked for the election of Jefferson, which tells you how much Hamilton despised Burr. And of course, we know how that ends up. But Hamilton was also no fan of Jefferson. He disliked Jefferson's democratic and egalitarian principles, but feared and mistrusted Burr as an unprincipled opportunist. The outcome hung on Federalist bargaining with both Jefferson and Burr. In return for their vote, Federalist House members sought a commitment from either to preserve Hamilton's economic program, which was centered on manufacturing. Also, they wanted the Federalists said, we'll vote for you if you keep the enhanced Navy intact and leave Federalist office holders in their jobs. Burr said, I am not signing any deals. Jefferson denies making a bargain, although Federalists claim that he did. On the 36th ballot, a number of Federalists broke from Burr and gave their votes to Jefferson. The final House vote was Jefferson with 10 states, Burr with 4, and 2 states abstained, those 2 states being South Carolina and Delaware. When Jefferson assumed office, his opponents stepped down peacefully. This return to domestic tranquility established a very powerful precedent. Although Adams tried to entrench federal power in the new administration by appointing Federalist judges in the last weeks of his term, this was viewed as acceptable politics. Jefferson's refusal to honor these last-minute midnight appointments led to the landmark Supreme Court decision of Marbury versus Madison in 1803. And we'll talk about that a little bit. Jefferson wanted a government that would respect the authority of individual states, operate with less bureaucracy, and decrease its debt. Jefferson also felt that the United States should eliminate Hamilton's standing army by relying on what he called a disciplined militia for national defense. He believed that good government should promote agriculture, not manufacturing. So again, taking another swipe at Hamilton here. He decreased the number of employees subject to presidential appointment. He decreases the army to 2 regiments, 1 infantry and 1 artillery, with similar reductions in the Navy. He pressures Congress to abolish the direct tax of 1798 and repeal the Alien and Sedition Acts. To emphasize his opposition to the acts, Jefferson personally pardoned the 10 victims of those laws who were still in prison. After paying $15 million in cash for the Louisiana Purchase, the national debt actually decreases from $80 million to $57 million during Jefferson's 2 terms. We will talk about the Louisiana Purchase in a little bit. Radical Democratic Republicans pressured Jefferson and the Democratic Republican-dominated Congress to make war on the Federalist judiciary. Almost sounds like what's happening today, and really what happens with every presidency. The importance of judicial appointments, both to the Supreme Court and the federal bench, seems to get higher and higher and higher. The Federalist-controlled Congress under Washington and Adams created a system of circuit courts that was presided over by the individual justices of the Supreme Court, all of whom were Federalists in 1800. Most of the lower judges on the circuit were also Federalists who had actively enforced the Alien and Sedition Acts, mainly against Democratic Republicans. Just before Jefferson's inauguration, the lame duck Federalist Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1801. This piece of legislation decreased the number of Supreme Court justices from 6 to 5, limiting Jefferson's ability to make appointments of Democratic Republicans. To hinder the incoming Democratic-Republican administration, the act created a new system of circuit courts with 16 new judges and many more federal attorneys, clerks, federal marshals, and justices of the peace. On his last day in office, Adams worked until late in the night signing commissions for these judicial officers, all of whom were strong Federalists. The commissions remained in the government offices when Jefferson became president, and Madison becomes his Secretary of State. Madison refuses to deliver the commissions, keeping some of the new Federalist judges off the bench. Jefferson is powerless at first to dismiss the federal judges because they were appointed for life, but he does replace most of the marshals and other court officers with Democratic Republicans in 1802, or with Democratic Republicans, pardon me. In 1802, the Democratic-controlled Congress simply repeals the Judiciary Act of 1801, doing away with Adams' midnight appointees. The Federalist-dominated Supreme Court, who were appointed for life and led by recently appointed Chief Justice John Marshall, greatly irritated most of the Democratic Republicans. 2 impeachment proceedings were initiated to test the waters of removal of the Federalist justices by trial. According to the Constitution, a federal judge can be removed from office only for high crimes and misdemeanors. In the first test, Justice John Pickering, a partisan Federalist who was also a raging alcoholic, was tried by the Senate based upon articles of impeachment drawn by the House. Pickering is removed from office by a strict party vote. The other target for impeachment was Justice Samuel Chase, who was able but nearly fanatical in his work against Jefferson. He frequently delivers very acerbic opinions from the bench. Fortunately for Chase, he had defenders among moderate Democratic Republicans in the Senate who feared that they may be overreaching their authority. If Congress only felt that way now, that would be great. I agree, Andy. It would be nice if there was some tranquility now. In Chase's case, the Senate failed to carry a two-thirds majority vote in favor of conviction. Chief Justice John Marshall was a loyal Federalist. He demonstrated commitment to a strong national government in the case of Marbury versus Madison in 1803. Madison remembers the Secretary of State. He refuses to deliver a last-minute Justice of the Peace Commission to William Marbury, who is a wealthy land speculator in the District of Columbia, who was appointed in the final hours of the Adams administration. Marbury, claiming that his appointment could not be denied, petitioned for a writ of mandamus, or a formal order of delivery, compelling the delivery of his commission. After hearing the case, the Supreme Court, without dissent, denied the writ, although it agreed that the petitioners were entitled to their commissions. Marshall held that the Constitution did not give the Supreme Court the authority to issue writs of mandamus. In making this ruling, the court declares unconstitutional that portion of the Judiciary Act of 1789, which gave the court the power to issue such writs. This ruling establishes, for the first time, the principle that the Supreme Court can declare an act of Congress void if it's inconsistent with the Constitution. Think of it now. Anytime there's a Supreme Court nominee, they're asked if they loosely interpret the Constitution, are they a strict constructionist, those sorts of things. This is Marbury versus Madison to a degree. Marbury versus Madison is a landmark case. It establishes the basis for judicial review of congressional and executive actions on constitutional grounds. The Democratic Republican Congress repeals the Judiciary Act of 1801 rather than challenge Marshall, the Chief Justice. Jefferson, who is an admirer of Marshall's intelligence, agrees with the moderate wing of the Democratic Republican Party, who believed that Marshall's support of an independent judiciary posed no threat to Republican liberties. I think we are going to end there today. Tomorrow, we will talk about the foreign policy of Thomas Jefferson, including the Louisiana Purchase, because I want to spend a little bit of time on that, and we're just about towards the end of today's lesson. So thank you to all who joined. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask anytime during the presentation. If you're watching this taped on Facebook or on YouTube at History for Shut-ins on YouTube, please feel free to ask questions at that point. Thank you again to all who joined. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Have a great evening. Take good care.